Hello there and welcome to Brussels, My Love, Euronews' weekly talk show about all there is to like and dislike about EU politics and policies. I'm Maeve McMahon. Thanks for tuning in. Coming up this week, 1 month into a new US administration that has warned Brussels to, quote, deregulate or die trying, the EU Commission President has a plan up her sleeve. As part of a simplification drive set out in its 2025 work programme, Ursula von der Leyen is soon to present the so-called omnibus package, the first part of a bonfire of red tape for companies doing business here. Set to go up in smoke, piles of environmental legislation that took years of often heated debate to put in place. And it's a dream for President Trump, but a nightmare for Brussels. Washington is making good on promises to impose hefty tariffs on all US trading partners that come into play as early as April. The EU is one of America's largest economic partners with more than 1.5 trillion euros at stake. So as you can imagine, we are nervous. European wine and whiskey producers and car makers among those whose fate could now be dependent on a rather unpredictable US president. A warm welcome to our panel this weekend. Ben Butters, Chief Executive Officer at Eurochambre. Chloe Michalak-Jack, a climate activist. And Corey Bennett, Energy and Climate Editor for Politico Europe. Thank you so much for joining us. But as always, before we hear from you, let's just hear exactly what the Brussels bubble was talking about this week.
Make Europe competitive again. The mantra Ursula von der Leyen has adopted to make the European economy more attractive. How? By following a lightning-fast deregulation drive that has left professional Brussels watchers dizzy. The buzzword is simplification. EU rules are being slashed, reflecting a rapid shift in priorities away from the climate and toward a business-friendly environment. On the chopping block is much of the green policy that the EU Commission has implemented during von der Leyen's first term. According to observers, the executive is under pressure from right-wing governments and the prospect of more big countries abandoning the principles of the Green Deal like Germany and France. Is climate policy a thing of the past, or is von der Leyen just playing to the gallery?
So there you have it there on the chopping board, directives like the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and also the EU Taxonomy. I mean, these were kind of game-changing directives that were meant to make sure that companies put the planet and nature also in their minds when they're trying to make profit. Chloe, this is obviously something you're watching carefully. How does this make you feel to see the Commission roll back on progress?
It's making me feel incredibly worried and incredibly angry. I mean, as you mentioned in the introduction, these laws took years of negotiations, of compromise to be adopted. And now we're basically telling the rest of the world that they don't matter that much, even though they're super, super important. And if you actually look at a recent analysis by the European Environmental Agency, we're nowhere on track, even if we implement everything that's in the Green Deal to reach our climate targets anyway. So we actually don't need less regulation, we need more. And I don't say this, I think the simplification narrative is a narrative because it's not about competitiveness. We are going to reopen these laws. This is what we're hearing coming from the Commission. We are going to actually reopen these laws to modify them in depth. It's not just simplification. And if I were a business, and I was thinking about setting up in Europe, I wouldn't want to because they're changing their rules every 6 months. I mean, the legislative uncertainty is insane for companies.
Well, that's
so
a
many
valid
of them
point.
have
I mean,
called,
businesses do want certainty, they want consistency. But Chloe, they're saying that she would like more regulation. I mean, what's it like doing business today in the EU?
It's very difficult. It's a struggle for many businesses, particularly smaller businesses. A couple of weeks ago, earlier this month, we had an entrepreneur from Hessen in Germany over. Her company is a metalworking company with 70 employees. She said she spends her whole time writing reports, completing reports, paperwork, and that many of her peers from other companies, she's the president of her local chamber, they're just shutting up shop. They can't deal with it anymore. These are small businesses ingrained in their local economy, part of the community. They're not the big faceless corporations that we often hear caricatured. These are small companies that have been there for over 100 years and they're struggling to deal with this.
Corey, you've been following the intricacies of all these regulations. You've been 4 years here in Brussels as a reporter. What's been the reaction in this town to ditching all this regulation?
Well, so I guess the question is it a narrative, or is the Commission telling the truth when it says it can actually reduce 25% of overall red tape, paperwork, etc. for larger companies, 35% for smaller companies, without actually abandoning its larger targets? I mean, to be clear, the Commission has not abandoned its goals for 2050. It has stood behind its goal to cut 90% of emissions by 2040, and it claims we can still get there even with the tweaks that are going on with these laws. I think the problem is we don't know if that is actually true.
And we've seen from the Spanish government, they've said this week they're against watering down requirements from multiple EU sustainable reporting rules. Because, of course, companies have been getting ready for this moment. They've been spending the last couple of years speaking to lawyers, preparing, and then to get these kind of mixed signals from Brussels. On this point of certainty, consistency, you need clear messages coming out as well of the Commission.
Well, yeah, for sure. Businesses crave certainty. They want to plan, but not at any cost. If the certainty is detrimental to their business, it needs to be looked at again. I don't share this view that we're talking about a bonfire of regulations, reducing the regulations. The Commission is committed to retaining these regulations. They're just looking at the reporting requirements, many of which overlap or even duplicate and contradict sometimes between different pieces of legislation. And why should businesses have to provide reporting that in many cases won't even be read?
Have we been exaggerating then, the media? Is it our fault?
Can I react to that? Because actually this is what we're hearing a lot, is that it's going to affect small businesses and that there's doubling of requirements. And it's actually not true. So the due diligence, which is basically to hold companies responsible for what happens in the supply chain, if you already have a plan under the other regulation that's targeted, which is called the CSRD, which is basically reporting requirements, you don't need a new plan for the other due diligence regulation. And SMEs are not concerned. So only listed SMEs are concerned by the reporting regulation. So that's a very, very tiny portion of SMEs. And on the CSDDD, so the due diligence one, the threshold is so high that it only concerns 0.02% of European companies. So it's not, we're hearing that narrative that our baker at the end of the street is going to really struggle, to fill all this paperwork. It's absolutely, they're not true. They're not concerned.
We're hearing stories.
It's not just a narrative, it's the reality.
It's the reality.
Because the larger companies are passing on the reporting burden to companies in their supply chain.
But in the laws, they don't have to. They have to provide economic, but they have to provide economic support to the other companies that are in the supply chain. So that's a problem if they don't do it. But it's actually not the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law says to big companies, you need to support your partners in your supply chain. You need to have an approach that is based on risk. So that's not all your partners. It's only the riskiest one.
But is that really the way to pursue the Green Deal, to oblige large companies to subsidise smaller companies to cover their reporting costs? We should be helping them to invest, to innovate, to grow. And if we all spend our time working out how we can comply with unnecessary reporting requirements, it's just distracting.
So why is it unnecessary?
You would think
it is necessary.
Nobody's going to read it.
You would think in 2025 we could use AI, right, to help us out here, Corey? I mean, that just seems like so much time wasted. Absolutely.
But I do think the overwhelming political reality is, whether you see it from your perspective or from your perspective, the Commission in this term wants to be perceived as listening to the concerns of business. If you look back at the Antwerp Declaration from 2024, when I think it was 73 business groups came together, had a list of things that they wanted. Literally the first thing on that list was an omnibus simplification package. It wanted to be the first legislative proposal. That is what exactly they are getting. Ursula von der Leyen will then go meet them in Antwerp to talk about it.
And let's be honest now, the industry have been very loud with their complaints. The farmers have been very loud with their complaints. They've been on the streets. But where are the Friday for Future marches? You're gone.
No, we're not gone. We're still there. We scream, but decision makers want to listen less to us. That's for sure. That's a fact. And it's very problematic because, as I mentioned, we're not on track to meet our targets, despite what everybody's claiming, despite what we're hearing that the Commission still wants to uphold the Green Deal. It's not at all the case. We're seeing these regulations under the narrative of simplification. They're going to be reopened and changed in depth. It's not about simplification. It's a full-blown attack on the Green Deal that's led by conservatives, that's led by the far right. I mean, if you hear the far right, they've recently reached out to other groups to say, let's scrap the Green Deal altogether. And you mentioned the big businesses and the Antwerp Declaration. I think it really begs the question is, competitiveness for who? You know, are we really thinking about these big corporations that are asking for more simplification? Are we talking about small businesses that for most of them are not concerned? Or are we thinking about European citizens and our well-being and not just the pursuit of just economic growth for the sake of economic growth?
Well, you mentioned the big corporations. On that point, we wanted to get the view from big industry. So we had a chat with the Italian Chemical Federation, Federchimica. We can take a listen to Piercarlo Frigerio.
Indubbiamente la pressione regolatoria e le normative ambientali europee stanno incidendo su...
Clearly, regulatory pressure and European environmental regulations are impacting industrial production. The decline in chemical industry output, which dropped by 10% across Europe in 2023, raises the risk of European deindustrialization, ultimately benefiting external competitors.
Quindi sicuramente un passo...
Omnibus is a step in the right direction. Something the industry strongly hopes for is implementing concrete measures to enhance competitiveness. What the sector cannot afford is to wait too long. We have already surpassed the 2030 target.
Al 2030.
So that's Piercarlo Frigerio there stating that the sector cannot afford to wait for long. And it's no secret, Chloe, that the European industry is in decline. Is it something you're worried about?
You know what else can't afford to wait too long? Climate, biodiversity, nature, people's health. All of these things cannot afford to wait too long. And we've already waited too long. So I hear the need for simplification. I don't think anyone can be against simplification. No one wants to spend the entire days just filling paperwork for the sake of filling paperwork. But once again, that's not what we're seeing here. We're seeing here this used as an excuse to basically attack the Green Deal, all of these regulations that made Europe proud. And that made us proud, actually. We were proud of these regulations, even if they weren't enough. So seeing this really roll back because we want to do a race to the bottom with the US or China, which we will never win, by the way, because we're not as strong economically as these countries. Let's keep being proud of what makes us different. And that is a strong regulatory framework that protects, or aims at least to protect, nature and the environment.
Ben, your thoughts on the Green Deal and how your companies feel? I'm sure they want to be sustainable too. That's what consumers are asking for as well.
Absolutely. And that sense of pride in being fastest mover on the regulatory regime is not shared across the business community. We want to be proud of an economy that is innovative, that enables people and companies to invest in the future, to invest in clean tech. And the more that we regulate, the more reporting requirements we impose on business, the less likely that is. And it doesn't help the climate response either, because companies move outside Europe into other economies which have different requirements. And Europe, which is responsible for somewhere between 7 to 9% of CO2 emissions, deindustrializes. And that is problematic, not just in terms of the global climate response, but also in terms of our competitiveness.
And that's the point that Mario Draghi made, Enrico Letta, in his big, massive reports about how we need to be more competitive, by leaving perhaps the Green Deal behind and creating this new Green Industrial Deal.
I think the idea is to embed climate policies within industrial policies, right? That is the point of the Clean Industrial Deal, at least as it is being pitched by Ursula von der Leyen. Whether you can actually marry those two things, I think, is an open question. There appear to be a lot of competing impulses. They're claiming that they can kind of help everyone when what people want out of the Clean Industrial Deal are at times mutually exclusive. So they can't necessarily please everyone with what they're trying to do. But as we're both touching on here, there is a broader geopolitical climate at play here, which is the return of Donald Trump to the White House in the US, and the fact that global climate diplomacy has gone into a deep freeze, and that a lot of the international pledges that have been made are now have huge question marks hanging over them. And I do think the EU feels under pressure as essentially the last pillar standing in this global climate diplomacy.
And it's clear that the Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, under a lot of political pressure from her political group, also from the far right, as you mentioned. We saw Jordan Bardella, a very well-known French politician, this week putting out a statement on the Green Deal, saying that, you know, we should join forces to propose the suspension of the Green Deal in response to very attractive measures for the economy and for businesses that Donald Trump is going to introduce in the United States. It seems like it's kind of cool now to not care about the environment, Chloe.
Yeah, and I think, this statement is exactly what I was saying. It really feels like it's basically an excuse to attack the Green Deal by the far right. And they're really holding their hands to the EPP, being like, hey, let's work together to scrap the Green Deal. And this is really, really problematic. But I think we also need to remind people and remind viewers that this is not what every businesses want. There's been many calls from different businesses larger and smaller, to not basically deregulate these roles that we're talking about here. There's been calls by investors worth 6 trillion euros. I mean, for me, it's always a little bit difficult to imagine what 6 trillion, but it's massive. It's actually dollars. And even inside the European Parliament, there's 2 commissioners, including Vice President Ribeiro, which is the number 2, and Commissioner Hoekstra, who have made statements even a few weeks ago, and they were saying we shouldn't deregulate. So I think it's important to remind that the narrative isn't just, yes, let's deregulate, let's cut all of these rules, these environmental rules. There's many people who are saying exactly the contrary.
The shift in rhetoric from the EPP, while they have said in response to the statement that you have from Jordan Bardella that they will not form any sort of formal alliance with him to go after the Green Deal, they do have members who are essentially aping far-right rhetoric on climate policy, on green policy, and that is emboldening the far right. So even if they are not actively or formally collaborating, certainly the EPP's rhetoric has moved towards the far right and risen their profile on this issue.
And meanwhile, the Socialists and the Greens have lost a lot of public support, so their voices, of course, are not as heard as louder as they were before in the past. So how do you see us here finding the right way forward? Because we've heard from Chloe what's at stake. I mean, we've seen reports coming out every week from scientists about what is at stake. But how do we get there?
We're encouraged by the way the Commission is moving with the simplification reality checks, the discussions that took place earlier this month, the forthcoming omnibus proposal on ESG, environmental social governance legislation, including some of the directives which have been discussed. But it has to go further than that in terms of tackling unnecessary, overlapping, obsolete reporting obligations. There was a study recently what the Directorate General for Environment within the European Commission requires. There are 41 directives from this department of the Commission which impose 110 different reporting requirements on businesses, and that's just from one Directorate General of the Commission. So we're going way beyond what's going to be in this omnibus simplification proposal in a couple of weeks. So we need to review carefully and consistently the reporting obligations on business to make sure that we're able to reach the policy objective in a manner that doesn't stop businesses from growing, from creating jobs and from innovating.
So what will you be looking out for this year? We've got the Omnibus, we've got the Competitive Compass, we've got the 2025 Working Programme.
I'm actually interested. So they've said that there will be at least 5 omnibus packages, and I'm very curious about that at least portion. I mean, this is just what we're going to see in 2025, and so I'm very curious what happens when we go beyond this kind of initial look at some of the reporting requirements and we move into more of a discussion around investment rules, around finance rules, and what direction the Commission wants to take there. I'm also very curious how the Clean Industrial Deal is presented. I want to see, so we actually got a look at the Clean Industrial Deal. We got a look at a draft, and not a ton of surprises in there, but there are a number of what you would objectively call protectionist measures in there, right? Made in Europe quotas for public contracts. And the idea is both that encourages industrialization and encourages people to buy climate-friendly products. That, I think, might run into some challenges. I think that will be a topic of controversy. It's a very change in, it's a paradigm shift a bit for the European Union, and I'm interested to see how that plays once it's formally out there.
And you mentioned earlier, Corey, the Antwerp Declaration. We know that President Ursula von der Leyen will be in Antwerp next Friday. She'll be speaking to CEOs, presenting all these ideas.
That's right.
Your thoughts, perhaps, on this Clean Industrial Deal?
I think we're also curious to see what's in there because we're not against reindustrialization. We're not against businesses doing good. I think it also begs the question of which businesses, right? I mean, which businesses are we supporting? And when Ursula von der Leyen goes to basically BASF's office, because it's important to remind people what's in Antwerp and why she's going there. She's going there because this is where BASF's office, one of the biggest chemical companies in the world that is making billions in profits every year. What kind of messages does that send? You know, is it I'm here to defend the interest of big corporations, or am I here to defend the interest of European citizens? And just on the Clean Industrial Deal, I think if it's done well, it's a great opportunity, right? And I think we want to support this and the ambitious voices within the European Commission. I think we'll look at it carefully because it can also be a strategy to, you know, do things slightly different way and maybe to keep promoting deregulation. And I think it also begs the question of where does the money come from? You know, how can we actually support industry that really want to transition, and not the ones that are delaying it, but the ones that really want to change.
Money is the key.
Where does the money come from?
And that's what Mario Draghi warned as well. We need
and also remember, we're about to have budget conversations coming up.
So. Pace yourself.
There you go.
Pace yourself. Ben, your reaction to that?
Well, the question of money is, of course, a fundamental one, and the amounts that Mario Draghi was talking about are vast. But the money comes from the economy, from a growing, thriving economy. So we need to make sure that the ingredients are in place to enable our company to grow. The economy has stagnated for the last year or two. Bankruptcies are going up. So we have a problem, and we're not going to tackle that problem by adding more and more layers of reporting. I actually agree with Chloe on the point about the optics of going to a large corporation. We would be delighted if President von der Leyen and her college would come and visit some of our businesses, some of the smaller businesses, which are also struggling, as I said, with reporting requirements. The door is always open. We'd be delighted to facilitate that.
Very diplomatic.
The door is always open. Well, maybe she's watching now. I know she's in Barbados this week, so she's probably rather busy.
Someone's got to do it.
But as you say, the door is always open, yeah. And I think there's a real feeling in this town that it's time to come out of the Berlaymont, or the ivory cage, as many call the headquarters of the European Commission here in Brussels, and to go down to the people and listen to the main concerns of people, and of course as well of small to medium businesses that, as we always say, are the backbone of our economy here in the EU.
Although perhaps ironically, it does seem increasingly that decision-making is being centralized within the Commission, right? Even in the production of the Clean Industrial Deal, there was a period where we felt like it was probably literally just von der Leyen herself and maybe a couple aides around her who had seen it, who were developing it. And it's only very recently that it is now going to a broader circle.
And even on that, on the omnibus package process, there was supposed to be a consultation.
Right.
And I just want to explain what this consultation looked like. It was basically 2 days, and on the second day there was 1 hour per file, so 1 hour for this due diligence regulation, 1 on reporting, 1 on taxonomy. These are files that took years to negotiate. 1 hour per
1
file.
hour is not enough, and on that point we'll have to conclude this conversation. For more information, do check out yournews.com. But stay with us, because after the break we'll be telling you how the US President Donald Trump's favourite word, tariff, is causing a major headache for the EU Commission's Trade Department, which of course trades on behalf of the whole EU. See you soon. Welcome back to Brussels, my love, Euronews' weekly politics show. I'm Maeve McMahon, and with the help of this weekend's panel, we're just taking a look back at the news of the week. And one we're taking a look at very carefully is this: the EU's Trade Commissioner, Maros Šefčovič, jetting off to Washington, D.C. to stave off a full-blown trade war with one of our closest trading blocs, the United States. The Slovakian veteran politician told the US administration that the Europeans are open to talk, and he would do anything to resolve any issue at stake instead of having to go through what he called awful, awful pain. I mean, this is pretty dramatic, right? I mean, this is a major, major crisis. What's at stake here, Ben?
A great deal is at stake. This is the transatlantic trade relationship is hugely important to the global economy and to Europe's economy. So a lot is at stake. We also feel it's based on a misconception that there is a trade imbalance. When you look at the figures for both goods and services, it's pretty much even, in fact. And to us, that's what trade should be about. You focus on your competitive advantages, and there's complementarity. So the EU exports goods and the US exports services. That's how the global economy should work. So we're very worried about all these discussions about tariffs being introduced.
Even though the Commission, Corey, has said it's been preparing for this eventuality for over a year now, they knew exactly what inevitably could come about. We saw Maros Šefčovič saying he could reduce the surplus in goods and services with the US, for example, which reached 50 billion last year. He could reduce as well the tariffs on cars, which of course Donald Trump despises. Will we be able to get through this tricky time?
The problem is you never know with Donald Trump. The thing to do with him is you have to take him seriously, but not literally. And oftentimes in a situation like this, especially with a trade negotiation, his history, and I used to work in Washington, D.C., I used to be a White House editor, the point is not necessarily imposing tariffs with him. The point is brinksmanship. The point is the negotiation. The point is seeming like he has come away with some type of win. Now, the problem is it's not always clear exactly what you can give him to make him feel like he can claim victory. Obviously, the EU has prepared a lot of goodies. They're keen to buy more American LNG, for instance. You talked about the car tariff. But they can't necessarily solve everything or speak to every issue that gets on his mind. You know, the VAT, for instance, you know, he's obsessed with the concept of the value-added tax being a tariff when, I understand it, I'm not an economic expert, Ben, you would know better than I, but it's not a tariff.
It's the same for everyone. It doesn't matter whether you're from the US, from South Korea, or from Europe. Everybody has to pay VAT. It's a reciprocal arrangement. It's, again,
it's a
pain,
but it's...
But you can't convince Donald Trump otherwise necessarily. So that's the wild card in this situation.
Chloe, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's just another proof that Donald Trump works on threats and on terror, even for their so-called partners. And I think it's time that the EU really reacts swiftly, strongly, and as a bloc, because we can't keep like shaking in our boots, like the Americans say, every 4 years, every time the president changes. And I just want to point something that I've been hearing quite a lot in Brussels is this idea that to appease him, we could buy more LNG, more energy from him, more LNG. And this is the worst idea ever, because first of all, the EU is importing 40% of its LNG from the US. So we don't want to increase our dependency to the US and find ourselves in an awful situation. And then second of all, LNG is terrible, absolutely
liquefied
terrible.
Gas just
liquefied, exactly, energy gas that comes from fracking. So it's terrible for climate, and actually it's 1/3 more emission intensive than coal. So if we increase our dependency to LNG, then we automatically increase our carbon footprint. So that would be a terrible
drill,
solution.
baby, drill. Wasn't that his whole campaign motive? You're, of course, from the European Chamber of Commerce. We wanted to hear from the American Chamber of Commerce too, to hear how they feel about this potential looming trade war. So we had a chat with Thibault Lortie. He's their senior director. Take a listen.
As an organization, we don't support bringing tariffs up because ultimately they would bring up prices for consumers, but they would also disrupt the supply chains. The supply chains are very integrated across the Atlantic. So what we think the EU and the US should be focused on is advancing their commercial relationship as opposed to creating new trade barriers. And what we're hearing from the companies is a concern around the potential escalation of the trade dispute with the EU's intent to put in place countermeasures. At the same time, what we really see as well is a window of opportunity for both sides to talk to each other. The EU and the US can actually be creative and think about what could be put on the table. We're talking about energy, defense, existing tariffs to make sure that we avoid a negative spiral of tariffs that would basically just hurt our economies.
So that's Thibault Lortie from the American Chamber of Commerce, worried about how bad it could get. Can you give us some examples of how your members as well are concerned if it gets really bad?
Well, the whole economy is concerned. It's a massive injection of money into the European economy, the trade with the US. So anything that creates friction with that is problematic to businesses at large. For us, in parallel to, as Thibault said, trying to tackle these issues and to have a constructive dialogue with the US, I think this is also a signal that we need to focus on making sure that the EU itself is functioning properly, that the single market works properly. Mario Draghi said earlier this week that if we can tackle the non-tariff barriers within the EU, that would have an injection to our economy that would mean that the US input pales in significance. So we need to really work on that as well. We can't ignore the fact that this is happening, so we need to try and mitigate it, but in other ways.
So the EU needs to work on itself and not just react to everything Donald Trump says, President Trump. But we do remember back in the first era of the Donald Trump presidency, Jean-Claude Juncker, the former Commission President, he did manage to smooth out relations and via dialogue they did manage to come to a compromise. Do you think in the end kind of adults in the room will be able to do the same this time?
That is the pattern with a Trump negotiation, right? It's the same thing that we saw when he used to negotiate to try to get funding for his border wall, for instance. He shut down the government for weeks only to accept the deal that he was initially offered at the beginning. The deal he made with Jean-Claude Juncker that you mentioned also included an element about buying more American energy. Now, very arguably and quite credibly, that was a pretty empty deal. There was not necessarily anything the EU could tangibly do to make people buy more LNG, but it's about what you can have in that press conference.
Absolutely, it is indeed. Well, thank you so much to our panellists for being with us this weekend here on Brussels, my love, if you're curious about any of the topics. And of course, for more analysis on Maros Sefcovic and the outcome of his trip to DC this week, do take a deep dive into Euronews.com. Our trade reporters have been taking a closer look. But for now, thank you so much for joining us here. Take care and see you very soon here on Euronews. Hello there and welcome to Brussels, my love, Euronews' weekly chat show on European affairs. I'm Maeve McMahon and I'm joined here in the studio by Ben Butters, the Chief Executive Officer at Eurochambre, Chloe Michalakjak, climate and environmentalist activist, and Corey Bennett, Energy and Climate Editor for Politico Europe. And while we were taking a look back at the news this week, one trend that was hard to ignore was this. Corruption here in Europe is not just sticking around. It's getting worse for the second year in a row. That's according to a new report by Transparency International. Several European countries are regressing on their corruption index, including major economies like France and Germany. Meanwhile, Romania, Bulgaria and Hungary are the most corrupt. And corruption still pretty high in Italy and Greece, the same as last year. So these are pretty gloomy statistics to come out of corruption, or of Transparency International, but perhaps not surprising, Corey.
Well, it's an issue that the EU has been grappling with for a number of years now, and you can see that they've tried to address it in a number of ways, right? Initially, they tried to pursue Article 7 proceedings against Hungary, which potentially could strip them of their voting rights. That went nowhere. They put conditions on EU funds going to countries. We've seen them attempt to withhold funds and freeze funds, but it's not necessarily changed behavior. They have a new prosecutor's office. That's going after, doing some good work. It's gotten off the ground, launched over 200 cases last year. But once again, Hungary is not participating in the prosecutor's office.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised. Everywhere I look, whether it's at the national level or the EU level, I see corruption, or I see, cases where decision makers and private interests are just too close for comfort. And it's really worrying because I don't think decision makers, including here and especially here in Brussels, realize the impact that has on citizens. And especially when people are really struggling with the cost of living crisis, that creates such a distrust for the institutions and a distance. People don't go out to vote because they feel like this doesn't make a difference. So that, for me, is extremely worrying. And I get people all the time that tell me, why should I get involved? Why should I mobilize? Why should I ask my decision makers to do something? Because anyway, everything's corrupt, nothing's going to change. And we don't see really any signal, I feel, from the EU level, as you mentioned. I mean, nothing's really changing. And until something really is done about it, people are going to keep growing more and more distant.
But just to back up what you're saying there, I was reading reports indeed that many Europeans remain very sceptical about national governments' efforts to address corruption. And 65% of us feel that high-level corruption cases are not sufficiently pursued. We should really be leaders in this field, if you look globally, but rather we're laggers. And this is something, of course, that impacts business, Ben, as well. Is it something you're worried about? Because, of course, corruption discourages investments and limits economic growth.
Corruption is certainly something that we need to tackle. If you ask businesses whether it's a major problem, it doesn't rank among the top 3 or 4. But in practical terms, corruption translates for businesses into favouritism, into dubious selection processes in public procurement. There are many ways that it manifests itself from a business perspective, and that's not good for the economy for sure. Europe is, 6 out of 10 of the least corrupt countries in the world are in Europe. So, we're not worst in class for sure, but nonetheless, there's no room for complacency, and we need to tackle that. Anything that creates friction in the economy is problematic to us, and corruption certainly is part of that process.
So we're not worst in the class, but we have a couple who are best in the class here in the EU, and they're all in Scandinavia. Yep. What tips can we get from them, Chloe?
I think there's a lot of different things that we could ask Scandinavian countries about corruption. But I just want to go back to something else. It's not just corruption. I think it's the lack of exemplarity, more generally as well in politics, that really puts off people from engaging in the democratic process. And actually, there is something really positive, because there is this anti-corruption directive, which is currently being negotiated at the state of the trilogue. And it could be really good, but it only tackles the national level, of course. But there's a very high risk that it's going to get weakened by countries, not Scandinavian countries, but others that don't want to see really measures being imposed on them. And then there's the other level, which is problematic with this law, is that it doesn't address the European level. So for now, what we call Eurocrats, so people that are working in the city in EU institutions, are not covered. So basically, nothing really has been done post-Qatargate. And that, I think, was a massive wake-up call for so many Europeans who were like, what is happening in Brussels, you know? And nothing really has been done because basically the people are in charge of regulating themselves. And that never really works out.
I do think there's a question here about who should be expected to be addressing these issues, right? Frequently, we look to the EU because so much of the money that is being misspent is EU funds. It's post-pandemic recovery funds. It's the Common Agricultural Policy funds, which makes up a third of the EU budget. But the EU has a very limited ability to tackle this type of corruption. They only have competence over EU funds, cross-border fraud, that type of thing. They've tried to expand that. They tried to give this new European Public Prosecutor's Office that I mentioned the remit to go after things that are a challenge or that could threaten EU's financial interests. It's a vague mandate, one I think intentionally vague, so they can go after more types of crimes than they traditionally have. But this is not something they were traditionally set up to do. And so there is a bit of a gap between what I think they perhaps need to do or people might want them to do and what they are capable of doing with their current level of staffing, resources and competences.
It's just on the worst pupils, according to Transparency International, Romania, Bulgaria and Hungary, they're listed. Is that a problem when it comes to doing business, do you think, in those countries?
It certainly is, not just in those countries as well, in other countries too. And chambers of commerce try to help companies to deal with it. They have toolkits to deal with the implications of corruption for small businesses in the Italian chambers, for example. So we do need to help them. Otherwise, it creates complexity and an unfair and unlevel playing field for businesses. To me, it all stems from rule of law. If that is respected, then corruption is likely to be less prominent than otherwise. So this is an issue that we're seeing in 2 or 3 member states in particular at the moment, of course, but nonetheless, that's where it starts and we need to work on that.
But yeah, there's also something that is really hopeful is that, for instance, what we're seeing in Serbia right now, the massive protest, and it started from probably a corruption case, time will tell, but when basically a train station collapsed and there's suspicion that the renovation work were linked to corruption with the government. And now we're seeing the largest protest in decades. We're seeing students, thousands of students, but also other parts of the population taking the street and asking for, transparency over the paper of who did the renovation and who should be in jail today, because this led to the death of people. So people are rising up against corruption.
They're also calling on Brussels for some sort of support or some sort of reaction, but so far they're sad because there was only silence. But on that very interesting point, we can bring this conversation to an end. Thank you so much to our guests, Ben Butters from Eurochambre, Chloe Mikulakjak and Corey Bennett from Political Europe. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for watching. And if you want to join the conversation and react to anything you have heard today, brusselsmylove@euronews.com. That is our email address. You can also follow us on social media, and we promise we'll get back to you. But thank you so much again for watching. Take care and see you very soon.